medicinal purpose as far as fertility, I don't know. It didn't seem like the results, we know in modern medicine that they use it for, that it did, but, here down to the period of time, we get into variants and changes in plants and things of that nature, so, but I did think that was kind of interesting to see that it's still used as in modern medicine. And so we find that Leah had seen these and she wanted these mandrakes, and Rachel did, and Rachel said, it's not a small matter thou hast taken my husband, but thou takest away my son's mandrakes also. You can see with Leah and with Rachel that interactivity, the friction, as we talked about before in this family between these two ladies. We also talked about something fascinating about Leah and Rachel that maybe we don't think about. We know Rachel is going to bear Joseph, who's going to wind up being the prime minister of Egypt during the famine, and we know that the children of Israel are going to go there, and the patriarchs are going to have to face him and what they done years later. But the lineage of Jesus Christ came through Leah. And I don't know that we stop and think about that a lot. That the tribe of Judah came through Leah, through Jesus Christ, through that lineage, through her. So she was really a greatly blessed woman when all was said and done, even though she had a lot she bore because of what the Bible says of her being loved less than Rachel and Jacob. He demonstrates that. And so we find that Jacob came out to field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night, and God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob a fifth son. So here we find she's going to bear a fifth son unto Jacob. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maid to my husband. And she called his name Ishkar. So we find here that Ishkar is born. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maid to my husband. She called his name Ishkar. And Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him six sons. And she called his name Zebulun. And so we find that the whole time this is going on in the heart and mind of Leah, she wants Jacob's attention. She wants to be accepted of Jacob. She wants to be the number one in his life, if you will. As we've already stated, and he's already demonstrated that she's not number one in his life. She's number two to Rachel. And yet we find that Leah continues on with the thought that maybe after having him all these sons and giving him all this prosperity, he would begin to love me like he would with Rachel. It's kind of a sad story, isn't it? It's really brother, kind of a love story, isn't it? In a way.
It's God working out his plan.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And this is the way he chose to work it out with these ladies here. So, anything you want to comment on that? I know I'm moving along pretty fast, but did you have a comment you wanted to make on that, Brother Cotton?
That word there in verse 20, where Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with him, because I born him six sons, and she called his name Zebulun. That word dowry is a word that you don't hear much about, but you do hear it in law even nowadays. Dowry is what the husband has to give the wife. That's what belongs to her. In other words, it's actually a part of him and her, but in a sense of the word, it really is what she deserves. In other words, she gets exactly what she deserves.
Yeah, and didn't we find that this wasn't a great dowry, was it? Those children.
Dowry nowadays is the first $50,000.
The what?
First $50,000. If the husband's worth it, wife Gibson.
Is that right? I didn't know that. I learned something this morning.
Yeah.
All right. That's interesting. You don't think about that like you said.
No,
This day and age.
that's the reason I made
Yeah.
mention of it. I
Yeah.
know, I had never paid a great lot of attention
Right.
myself.
Right.
But I knew the word dowry was one I was familiar with, but I didn't know it came out of the thought of what was going on then with
Yeah, I
Leah.
didn't either.
Leah and
Yeah.
Jacob.
Yeah, how about that? That's something you don't hear about much these days, this day. How about that? That's interesting. And so we find that in verse 21, we find the mention of a daughter. A daughter being born unto Leah, and afterwards she bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. And so we find that not much is said about the daughter. That's about what is said about the daughter. Daniel, I know you showed me in your Bible the meanings of some of these names and stuff. I was going to go over them, but you have them written down. Does it show anything about this Dinah in your footnotes? Yeah. Yeah.
It shows for all the guys, but not.
Yeah, doesn't make much mention of her, so. Okay. And now we're gonna get into Rachel. We're gonna find that from this point on that Leah and her handmaids are not gonna have any more children given unto Jacob. We're gonna find the story's gonna shift quite heavily toward Rachel and the children that she bore. You know, this was a competition, as we said, going on between these two women, and it was for Jacob's attention. So we find here as we move on, and I'm running through this kind of fast, so it is a narrative, and we'll glean what we can glean out of it, and we can kind of move on. I'm going to try to get as close as I can to chapter 31. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. We find this thought in the Bible that God controls the womb, the opening and closing of the womb. And so we find here that God's purpose and plan being carried out by how He managed the ability to have children between Rachel and Leah. And so we have this statement here about Him opening her womb to give her so that she could conceive and give her the things that she finally wanted. And it came to pass when Rachel had born Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, send me away that I may go unto my own place and unto my country. So we find that Rachel had Joseph, and Joseph is going to become a character, and I'll study later on several chapters in the future about the events that transpired in his life and about how through tragedy was triumph born again. Because it was tragic that the way his brothers treated him, sold him into Egyptian slavery. But God used what seemed so tragic for good, because it's through Joseph that the patriarchs are going to be able to survive, and the children of Israel, as we know of, are going to be born there in Egypt, and then later on Moses is going to lead them out. It's kind of interesting the way these events unfold. Right now it seems so sad and so tragic that the way these things are happening, this bit of competition. But what it teaches us is, in spite of what man may do, God's in control. God's in control. Does that mean we can go out and do whatever we want and all this kind of stuff? And no. If we expect to go to heaven, we can. But if people think they're getting around the will of God somehow, they're fooling themselves. If the heathen world thinks it's getting around the will of God somehow, it's fooling itself. God's will be done. And we see this demonstrated over and over. This is why we have the Old Testament given us our learning, so we can see how these things work, and we can see how God operated in the lives of these people to bring Christ into the world. In spite of their imperfections, God's will is going to be done, irregardless. And now we have Jacob. You know, he hadn't forgotten where he came from. He hadn't forgotten his home. He hadn't forgotten the promise that was given to his father, patriarchal father Abraham, and the blessings made to Isaac. He knew that he wasn't going to stay in Haran forever. And you know, when you look at this, if you want to put a time frame on it, this encompasses somewhere around, we know it for a fact, at least 14 years of his life was spent there because of the labor that was put in for Rachel and Leah. But we also know there were some other time frames of the period of time here that we're looking at that he was probably up there somewhere up to about 20 years, thereabouts, okay? And now he thinks about time to go home. But you know, there's an obstacle that he's going to have to face as he heads home here. One, he's going to have to face Laban. Two, even more so, is he's going to have to face his brother Esau that wanted to kill him, and that's why he fled to Haran in the first place. So it's going to get interesting, Jeff, before it gets any dull.
More envy.
Do what that?
More envy.
More envy, that's right, more envy. So it's really interesting how these things are unfolding. And of course, too, we know that he was sent away on the other purpose of it was, too, that God did not want him taking wives among the Canaanite people. And that Jacob's wife was going to come through Abraham's people, through his people, and they were back up in Haran. We know that Esau was all over the map. He was in, and that created the problem there. So there's a whole host of dynamics that we've already talked about that's going on in the background of this setting here. Anyway, he says it's time for me to go. Laban, it's time for you to send me away. It's time for me to head back. He said, I got to go back to the land that was promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And I've got to go back there and dwell there. And so he said, give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done. So Jacob says, well, I've done, it's kind of like what we would say today, I've done everything that you have requested of me to do. I have worked out my hire for my wives, so now it's time for me and my children to go. He said, it's time for us to go home. Back where I'm supposed to be, and back where I need it. And so we find that Laban said unto him, I pray, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. It's kind of an interesting statement he makes there. One is, we know we don't want Jacob to leave, but he's getting a pretty good shake out of all this, right? And he's got a hard-working man here. He's got somebody who has knowledge of animal husbandry, we're going to see. And so it's really prospering him. And I like the way that this is phrased here. Notice what he said here, that he had learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. And you got to remember, this guy's an idolater, okay? But he could see the Lord working in the lives of Jacob. That was the only explanation for it. It's kind of interesting that he would make that statement, because we're going to find that one of the things Rachel was going to do to show that the idolatry was still present in the lives of these people, she's going to take her father's teraphims or his family idols. Okay? And he's going to go back to Jacob looking for them, because a part of that, what's associated with those teraphims, has to do with inheritances and things like that. It was a family thing, kind of like a family icon. Okay, if you possess that family icon or icons, then that belongs to you, that inheritance. So it's kind of like I won't say a contract necessarily, but it's kind of like possession of that is 99% of the law, what we would say today. Okay? And so we find that these things are going to happen. And Laban said, that experience word. He could see, couldn't he?
He paid attention. He paid attention to what was happening. And it dawned upon him, this is all because of
Jacob's God.
yeah. It's because he's calling God, he actually calling God to bless me.
Yeah. Then Jacob, you know, and that's kind of amazing that and we found this before in these heathen rulers that we talked about, that we've encountered so far. Some of the statements they would make sometimes, whether they really understood what was going on or not, it's hard to determine, but they knew enough to where hey, there's something at work here, Brother Conn. You know? They recognized that. They sure did. They sure did. And the experience he's talking about, experience comes by what? Time, David. Oh, this 14-year period, he probably learned a lot about Jacob, didn't he? And no doubt Jacob was talking to him about the God of heaven, okay? And we talked about that, and I think we're going to touch on that maybe back in verse 31 about Bethel, where Jacob had the dream of the ladder going up and down that we talked about a few chapters earlier. You can kind of look at that point in life to say that that's Jacob's final conversion point. You know, and we talked about that in Genesis chapter 28. Because he said here in verse 21, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And we know that that's what the word Bethel means, house of God does. He realized that God was there in that place. Even though he didn't know beforehand, but he knew it then. And you can kind of look at that because one of the references that Jacob had made to Isaac was the fact that your God, remember we talked about that, Jim? He didn't say our God, or my God. He put it back on Jacob as if it was his God. I mean, Isaac. So, it's kind of interesting as this unfolds. And no doubt there was the presence of this at what Jacob was doing. No doubt he had talked about the event that transpired there at Bethel. You know? I mean, what was he doing here all this time? And so we find that these things are happening, and Jacob is getting ready to go, but Laban don't want him to go. And in verse 28, and he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it to thee. And he said unto him, thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hast before I came. Wow. Jacob was reminded him of some things. Laban, you wasn't as well off as you thought you would before I came. Laban recognizes after that experience, didn't he? That he's had with Jacob. And he said, and so he says, but there's been an increase unto a multitude. And notice what he tells Laban here. And the Lord has blessed thee since thy coming. Kind of like what you're talking about, Brother Conn. It was through God that was blessing him. See, God gave the increase, didn't he? And that's why Jacob is telling him. So when you tie that back into what is said up there with Laban making that statement, the Lord has blessed him, that's back in reference to Jacob's God. You know, here again, Laban's an idolater. But he's recognizing some facts here that he can't ignore. I have been blessed because of Jacob. Jacob's telling me it's because of his God. And that's what Jacob says. This reason he's being blessed is because of the God of Abraham and Isaac. If you got anything you want to add to that? I'm talking now, you know. If you got anything you want to throw in it down, you got anything in there? I think I'm down to verse 31. And he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. If thou will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. So, kind of a bargaining going on here. You know, Laban wants to know, well, you just tell me what it's going to take for you to stay on here. I want you to stay on. I don't want you to leave. What's it going to cost me now for you to stay here? And you know, what should I give you? Is there anything of mine that you want that I can give you to get you to stay? And so we find that Jacob is going to tell him, there's not anything I want you to give me. You know? That deal didn't seem like it was in the vocabulary of the Bible, does it, Brother Conn? It wasn't in Abraham's vocabulary. You know, they were willing to give him the land and the cave to bury Sarah in. Oh no, I'm on pay you. See, when you go get into this giving thing, it's already, this has been laid down. Giving, a lot of times, has strings attached. That means that now you're obligated. Abraham didn't want to be obligated to those nations around about him. That's why he wouldn't let them give him that land and that cave. You know, Jacob has already probably learned some lessons here about dealing with Laban. Laban can be kind of a treacherous businessman. You know, he might come out and appear with his agreement one way, but you might wind up with something else in the end. So he's learned something about Laban and how it happened. He said, you know, I've been obligated to Laban before, and when it came time for my pay to be due, which was Rachel, he gave me leave. So see, he's already done learned a few things. He said, I'm not going to get too obligated to this man in that manner. So this deal here is out of the question. So what's going to happen here? He says here, he said, I will do this. I will again feed our flocks, but this is what I would like to do. I'm going to work for this. You're not going to give it to me. I'm going to divide the flocks. Okay? It's kind of interesting the way he divides the flocks here. And the reason this is being done is so Jacob would know his flocks, and Laban knows his flocks. If they're all intermingled in basically the same coloration and all that, it's hard to tell them apart. Especially right now because the division of the shepherds had been made yet. And so we find here that Jacob says, I will pass through, verse 32, all thy flocks today. Remove from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle amongst the sheep, and spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. He said, you let me do this, I'm going to take care of them, just like I told you. I'm going to feed them, I'll feed your flock, I'll keep your flocks, but this is what I want in exchange for. This time Jacob's going to give him something really tangible for his labor that he's going to work this extra time. Remember we said there's a period of about 20 years here that's going on roughly somewhere like that. This is where it's coming in out of the labor. Okay. And so we find then shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled and spotted amongst the goats and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. See, Jacob, he's learned to be a little bit shrewd in dealing with Laban. He said, now we're going to do it this way because I don't want to get caught in this situation where there's animals out there and you say I done stole because of this, that, and the other. We're going to have a distinction here. Mine's going to be brown and speckled and spotted, and yours is going to be the natural colors, really is what he's getting at here. It's going to be a vast distinction between who owns what here. Because we're not going to get into this argument and discussion that I stole some of your animals. And so we find, Laban said, behold, I would it might according to thy word. So Laban accepts what we would call an agreement, a covenant between them. He accepts that. And so Jacob's got this thing set up now where there's a vast distinction between what they agreed that he was going to get and what Laban was going to get. And it says he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-staked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown amongst the sheep, and gave them into the hands of his son. So Jacob begins the dividing process of these goats and sheep and cattle. And notice something else that's going to do here. Not only did he do the dividing process, but he realized this time, I need to put some distance between myself and Laban. You know, he's learned some things himself. I'm not going to just let them hang here. We're going to put some distance between us. And so we find in the next verse, he said, 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. And so we find that there was some distance put in between them. And that was one of the things that caused some problems with Abraham, did it? And Lot. The herds got so big. And it got so huge in the well-watered plains of Jordan and over that area that it wouldn't contain them with it. And so they had to be a division. They had to separate. But Abraham, being the patriarch that he was, now he could have said, I want you to pack up all your junk and get the road and go that way. But he didn't do that, did he? Abraham was an honorable man. He was a man that was fast. So he told Lot, well, whichever way you choose, I'm going to go the opposite. So that division will be there. And of course, we talked about Lot. We're not going to back up there about the decision that was made about the well-watered plains of Jordan, that sometimes decisions can look so good and so right from a businessman's standpoint of view. I mean, hey, you got all these flocks and herds and animals and stuff like that. They're your livelihood. They're your money. What you got to have for them? You got to have water and grass, right? Seemed like the right way to go. But he didn't think that thing through because of what was going on up there in those well-watered plains amongst those 5 wicked cities up there with Sodom and Gomorrah and Zoar and all them, being exceedingly wicked. He was looking at it from the standpoint of a good business deal, but what are you getting yourself into? Sometimes we have to think about that today in our own lives, about maybe our jobs or careers or vocations that we have. Sometimes when promotions and things come along, they look so good and sound so good, and maybe the first initial reaction is we jump at it. Without thinking, well, where's this going to lead me? What direction is this going in? So it's something to think about a lot of times when these things come up. Is it what it seems to be? I remember a guy telling me, I'm going to stop right here. We've got about 2 minutes left. The thing that was going on in Tennessee. Anyway, it was a big meeting up there. Anyway, that evening we all went out to eat. And there's a guy sitting across from me, and by all standards, he was like Lot. He had the world on the table. He had a big gun job, high salary, flying all over the place, and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know why he looked up at me, but he looked at me and said, I can tell you the color of every wall, the pictures that was hanging on the walls, and the desk I sat at, the type of chair I was in every location that I've been in that I've traveled and moved about. He said, I can't tell you the color of my daughter's eyes. I was like, okay, where is this going? Where did this come from? He said, on top of that, he said, I would trade all this if I could get my wife and children back. That's what it's talking about sometimes these decisions and things look so good. The well-watered grass plains of Jordan look so good, didn't they? But what do you get yourself into? But don't stop and think about, well, seems like a good decision, but what are the ramifications? So anyway, I'm going to stop right there and bring this buzz and we'll get ready for the break.